Hello, everyone. Good afternoon from Oxford, or good morning, good evening, depending where you're calling in from today. Thank you for joining us for the 9th webinar session of our Engaging with Evidence series, and it is also the final one of 2021 before the new year. My name is Laura Bonsaver. I'm Communications and Engagement Officer here at the Government Outcomes Lab, based at the University of Oxford, and I'm absolutely delighted to be co-hosting this session today with my colleague, Andreea Anastasiu. For today's session, we'll be drawing on the recent research from the Government Outcomes Lab and the Sorbonne Business School of Paris to explore the role of cross-sector collaborations and innovative financing tools in supporting refugees. We'll be hearing from a panel of academics and from practitioners with lived experience delivering outcomes-based programs for refugees to better understand the barriers refugees are facing, the challenges of coordinating holistic support, and also the underlying mechanisms to drive robust outcomes-based approaches and programs. As we all know, this is a hugely salient and complex issue. Today, we want to focus in particular on how outcomes-based approaches can bring sustainable solutions to refugees as they settle into host communities. So, to briefly introduce ourselves, for those who might not be super familiar with the Government Outcomes Lab, we are a research and policy centre based here at the University of Oxford. We investigate how governments partner with the social sector and the private sector to improve social outcomes. So we look in particular at innovative financing tools, such as social impact bonds. Alongside our research as well, we have a multifaceted programme of engagement and capacity in building to ensure that all the research insights that we and others around the world are generating can be used in policy and practice and also be made accessible for everyone. That is why we launched the Engaging with Evidence series. So this series is a platform for policymakers, practitioners, and researchers from around the world to come together and engage in the latest findings in the field. These sessions are grounded in research, but most importantly, we want to facilitate an open discussion and look at practical considerations for those working on the ground. We'll be announcing the dates of our 2022 sessions in the coming weeks, so do sign up to our monthly newsletter for all the latest updates for our upcoming events. Coming back to today's session, we're going to follow a similar structure to what we've done with our previous sessions, where we start with a few presentations and then followed by a panel discussion. Firstly, we'll be hearing from Alexander Betts, Professor of Forced Migration and International Affairs at the University of Oxford, who will set the context on the challenges of coordinating holistic support for refugees. We'll then hear from Sorbonne academics Stéphane Saucier and Simon Pochet and GoLab Research and Policy Associate Tanya Hamid, who will present 2 case studies from Finland and France of cross-sector partnerships supporting refugees. Then for the second part of the session, my colleague Andreea will moderate a discussion with our wonderful panel of speakers. So alongside our academics, we'll be hearing from practitioner experts Beatrice Depledange, Head of Business Development at COIS, Joanna Penrose-Buckley, Head of Refugee Integration at the UK Home Office, and Samir Omar, Head of Programme Management at S-Bank in Finland. Before we hear from the speakers, it would be great to hear who is joining us today online. So please do say hello in the chat. Feel free to let us know where you're dialing in from today, because it is always so nice to see everyone joining from across sectors and right across the world as well. We like to keep our sessions interactive, so do please use our chat to answer any questions, share your reflections, connect with others. You know, people in the past have really enjoyed the networking element of the chat, so do feel free to use that too. Please note that we are recording this session. We will be showing the recording on our website and YouTube channel after the session. You'll also find the slides to the session on our website, which we can link in the chat. Final thing, it is always so nice to see everyone's faces, so do keep your cameras on if you can and if you like. And just a reminder to stay muted, basically, if anyone else is talking. Right, so without further ado, I'll hand over to our first speaker, Alexander Betts. Professor Betts, if you'd like to first introduce yourself, that would be amazing. So over to you.
Thanks, Laura, and thanks, Andreea and Tanya, for coordinating this session. I'm really excited to be part of it. My name's Professor Alexander Betts. I'm Professor of Forced Migration and International Affairs here in Oxford. Most of my work focuses on the economic lives of refugees, the contributions they make to their host societies, and tries to use that evidence to inform policy and practice to create ways in which we can recognize the skills, talents, aspirations of displaced populations, and in many ways shift the narrative from one of refugees as an inevitable burden on host societies to one where we see them as potential contributors. I really want to try and set the scene for the challenges that we're grappling with. And I think it's evident to everyone, and it's been tragically evident even in the British news over the last week or so, how important it is to think about policy questions and governance questions related to refugees and forced displacement. It should also be fairly clear that a lot of things are not working in the governance of this area. At the international level and at national level, there are dysfunctionalities in the system that different people are debating and seeking to grapple with. I think the first thing to say is that this is a pressing global challenge. It's one of the defining issues of our time. And I think I've characterized the juncture of history we're at as an age of displacement. And by that, I mean we face rising numbers and needs on the one hand, but declining political will to protect and assist refugees on the other hand. So globally, there are around 82 million displaced people, of whom about 26 million are refugees who have crossed an international border. And those are the highest numbers than at any time since the Second World War. They haven't necessarily increased dramatically relative to global population, but it is a high number. And those numbers are likely to increase given what we know about the drivers of displacement. That state fragility and increasingly climate change will continue to displace people from their homes. And collectively, there's an inability of the world to address fragile states and put back together war-torn or authoritarian governments. So we can expect displacement numbers to continue to remain high. But we also see declining political will, not just close to home in Europe, but around the world. There are major challenges that host countries, and it's worth highlighting that most refugee hosting countries are low and middle income countries face. And we see political polarization in the context of challenges around structural employment, major shifts in the global economy that are being articulated by politicians as being driven by migration. Migration and asylum have become scapegoat issues around the world for the experiences of populations in the context of global economic transformation. So we have the challenge of rising numbers, but declining political will. In theory, we have an international system, the refugee system, based on the UN agency, the United Nations Refugee Agency, UNHCR, and an international treaty, the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees, that between them are intended to support refugees' access to protection, which means basically all their rights under international public law, international refugee law, human rights law, humanitarian law, their civil and political rights, their socioeconomic rights, and to provide what are called durable solutions, a pathway of reintegration into the international state system, a pathway back to reintegration in the country they've come from or in another society. And those classic three durable solutions are repatriation, going home, resettlement, moving to a third country, or local integration, being given access to residency and a pathway to citizenship in the first country that they reach. Those durable solutions are basically broken and not available to refugees. In any given year, less than 2% of refugees get access to a durable solution. They can't go home to chronically fragile states. First countries of asylum, facing many of their own challenges, won't provide a route to citizenship. They'll insist that going home is the preferred solution. And resettlement is available to a tiny number of the world's refugees. Meanwhile, protection faces significant challenges because of underfunding of major humanitarian agencies. UN agencies work on a model of voluntary annual contributions. They rely on going to states and saying, please help us. States earmark those contributions, and humanitarian and relevant development programs are often underfunded. And that leads to significant consequences on the ground. It means that in camps or cities, there's an absence of basic assistance, an absence of adequate public services, healthcare, education available to refugees. And we see that in disproportionately low outcomes for refugees in terms of access to all stages of education and access to health and health outcomes, for instance, that are disproportionately and systematically lower for refugees compared to citizens of the same host countries. And I think alongside this observed failure, we have major structural challenges that the global refugee system faces. The first big question is, who is a refugee? With climate change, with people fleeing complex situations in fragile states, Afghanistan, Syria, Venezuela, South Sudan, Myanmar, it's not always obvious that the people fleeing fit the 1951 Convention definition of a refugee. They're not so much fleeing individualized persecution by a state out to get them, but often chronic fragility, often serious socioeconomic rights deprivation, gang violence, disturbances to public order. And that's led large populations like the Venezuelan population not to be labeled as refugees by the host country, but described as migrants or as externally displaced people. So the definition of a refugee who has a human rights entitlement to cross a border is contested. And that's understandable because in the present context, states are reluctant to expand the boundaries of who they have obligations to include. Another big structural challenge that I think exists at the global level is that the refugee system has had no model of what's called responsibility sharing. States have very clear legal obligations to refugees who reach their territory. They're not allowed to engage in what's called refoulement. They can't forcibly return people to a context in which they risk serious harm. But the obligation to support refugees who are on the territory of another country, for instance, European states' obligations to support refugees in Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, Ethiopia, Uganda, are largely discretionary. Other than a generalized commitment to international cooperation within international law, other than the preamble of the 1951 Convention that highlights the need for cooperation, contributions to resettlement, financial contributions to humanitarian and development aid by states are largely discretionary acts. And that creates an asymmetry in the system whereby responsibility is allocated to states mainly based on proximity. Nearby countries host significant numbers of refugees, far away countries host far fewer refugees. So in this context, I think it's worth just briefly underscoring some of the differences between the situation of high-income countries and low-income countries, because we have different challenges. Again, 85% of the world's refugees are in low and middle-income countries. They are not predominantly in Europe and not predominantly in North America and Australia, even if the media portrays it that way. In low-income countries, a majority are now in urban areas rather than camps, but in some regions like Africa, camps remain a predominant mode of protection. In camps, refugees often stay in protracted situations for many years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. Children are born into camps, grow up in camps. Many camps don't allow refugees to work, insist that refugees remain in those camps, and provide very few socioeconomic rights or educational opportunities. In cities, the challenges are a little bit different. We face a lack of assistance models for urban refugees. By moving to a city, many refugees give up access to assistance and rely on the informal economy or remittances or access to their own networks. And in the context of COVID-19 and the economic consequences of lockdown, those support networks, remittances, the informal economy have been significantly affected. When we shift to richer countries, the challenge is around political focus on irregular migration. More and more we see restrictive asylum policies around the world. And that's in North America, it's in Europe, it's in Australia, where the politics of polarization around immigration is affecting the protection space available to refugees. It's requiring receiving countries to be politically innovative and innovative in terms of policy. A focus of European countries is now much more on externalization, protecting refugees in regions of origin, and trying to limit their opportunities to use smuggling networks to reach their territories. And that creates a series of challenges, operational for states, but also human rights problems and risks of loss of life for those who seek to move onwards out of lack of alternative options. In the United States, we see a 25-year high in the number of people crossing the southwest border, many of whom are refugees. In the Mediterranean and even the English Channel, the majority of people crossing are likely to be refugees. And we know that because of the nationalities of the groups crossing, and we know it because recognition rates are very high. And yet from Denmark to the UK, there is significant political pressure for more restrictive policies. I think the question then is what states should be doing to create sustainable solutions in that context. All countries should be doing three things. providing asylum, leaving their borders open so that people have the right to seek asylum, offering some degree of resettlement or complementary migration pathway, labour migration visas, family reunification visas, education visas to refugees, and thirdly, contributing money, development assistance, humanitarian assistance. But the balance of those things is going to be different in different regions of the world. Arguably, the countries in low and middle income regions are more likely to be providing space to host people, and countries further away are more likely to contribute primarily with money and also resettlement places. And that differentiation of responsibility, common but differentiated responsibility, underlies the reality of the refugee system. It's not asymmetric contributions, and it's not going to be the case that refugees are equitably distributed around the world. So there is a comparative advantage that faraway countries and rich countries have through providing money and resettlement places and complementary pathways, but also, crucially, leaving some door open to asylum as a last resort. That bargain, if you like, underlies, I think, where we need to shift, that there needs to be much more creative financing, the use of development assistance rather than humanitarian assistance to support refugee self-reliance, to support access to jobs and education in host regions of the world where protection and access to solutions are inadequate. But surrounding it all, I think for rich countries, the message has to be to make that work, we need really significant levels of investment, but to leverage that, the business sector, the private sector, and financial innovation need to be a big part of the picture. So hopefully that just sets up briefly some of the global and more regional challenges that we face.
Thanks so much for that, Professor Betts, for setting up that really helpful context and also just articulating some of the complexities of the topic and ways in which states and organisations can try and change their approach. When we open the discussion later on, there'll be lots of opportunities as well for participants to ask questions to Professor Betts and our other panellists. So yeah, really looking forward to the discussion coming up soon. What we'll do now is we'll pass on to Tanya Hamid from the Go Lab and Professors Saucier and Boscher as they present the two examples of programs seeking to tackle some of these issues. So Tanya, I'll first maybe pass on to you. It would just be great if you tell us a bit about the research on these case studies and your thinking behind it. And if you could also introduce yourself, that would also be great. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Laura. Hi, everyone. My name is Tanya Hamid, and I'm a Research and Policy Associate at the Government Outcomes Lab. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. So just wanted to introduce our research before we go into the details. This is a piece of work we did earlier this year with our colleagues at the Sorbonne Business School, so Stefan and Simone, who are both here with us today. And the objective of this research was very much to look at the design and implementation of two innovative cross-sectoral partnerships, which were supporting refugees and immigrants in Europe. So on the one hand, we were looking at the Hemisphere Social Impact Fund, which is an innovative form of public-private partnerships. This is something that Simone will be talking about in more detail. And on the other hand, we were looking at the Koto Social Impact Bond, which is one of the biggest social impact bond projects in Europe and indeed the world. And it was also one of the first SIBs to support refugees. And this is a case study that I'll be discussing in just a few minutes. At the same time, this is a great opportunity for us to understand the potential added value as well as the challenges that each of these different approaches bring. So these are, of course, innovative and different ways of supporting refugees either into employment or into housing. And we really want to study what the additional value of the commissioning mechanism was here. And this is something that Professor Stefan will be going into a bit more detail on. In terms of the methodology, we used purely qualitative methods. So we conducted 44 semi-structured in-depth interviews with all the sort of key stakeholders across these two projects. And we also complemented this with documentary analysis. So I'll pass it on to Stefan to sort of set some of the context, and I'll be back in a few minutes to talk more about the Kyoto case study. So over to you, Stefan.
Thanks a lot, Tanya. Hi, everyone. So my name is Stefan Saucier. I'm an economist at the Sorbonne Business School, and I'm a specialist on public-private partnerships. And in fact, we started this project between the Sorbonne Business School and the Go Lab together with Tanya, Simon, Mara, and Eleanor, because just as Alex said a few minutes ago, we believe that there are huge challenges associated with welcoming and supporting refugees and migrants in Europe. And we saw that those difficulties force public authorities, force states to go beyond the usual solution and to push them to innovate, to experiment new ways of doing, even if there is a declining political will, as Alex said a few minutes ago. And I believe that cross-sector partnerships with social outcome-based contracts orientation might be a promising way. So why? Let me explain in a few minutes. So first of all, yes, you've got key promises associated with those cross-sector partnership. First, it is a way to gather resources that are usually fragmented among different organizations. So gathering the public sector, the private sector, and the social sector is a way to have access to a large range of resources, expertise, money, information, community engagement, and we need to have access to all those resources in order to face the grand challenge associated with the arrival of refugees and migrants in European countries. Such cross-sector partnerships are also coming with a contractual agreement that oblige to contract on outcomes. And it means that it provides incentive to the governments to well define their project, to think about precise objectives, to define clear metrics, and ultimately, if this is one objective for the governments, to be transparent about performances, because as soon as you've got proper metrics, you can communicate easily on your performances. Such cross-sector partnerships are also usually incentivizing parties with an outcome-based approach, with the funders, sometimes with the service providers being paid on results. And it permits flexibility and innovation because there is no obligation of means, but only obligation of results. And when the situation is changing, when you've got some unexpected event like COVID-19 crisis, for example, the service provider can adapt and innovate as long as the results are achieved. And lastly, when cross-sector partnerships involve infrastructure, that is quite rare, it might create synergies between the construction phase and the service delivery phase. I mean, in other words, infrastructures will be optimized depending on contracted objectives. And as an example, you will not construct accommodation center the same way, depending on the population to welcome tourists or refugees, for example, and depending on the social services to provide. And when the infrastructure is already there, when you are talking about a brownfield project, cross-sector partnerships will be usually based on long-term contracting that will permit the entity that is delivering the service to learn and improve performances over the length of the contract and ultimately to reach given objectives. So you've got many promises associated with cross-sector partnerships, but we should be aware, and this is the last slide, and the economic literature is warning us on this, that those promises associated with cross-sector partnerships are also coming with implementation challenges. First, gathering resources from the public, the private, and the social sector is complex because those sectors are not following the same objectives, so misunderstandings and conflicts are predictable. Also, contracting on metrics might be difficult. I mean, too crude performance indicators will inadequately measure performance. Too complex performance indicators might be costly to provide and follow. In both cases, metrics used to measure performances might not be well understood and accepted by service providers. And we will have some examples of this in the empirical part of the presentation in a few minutes. In addition, the outcome-based approach means that there is a risk transfer to the project funders. And if performance is not at the rendezvous, the project might be terminated. And when there is no infrastructure involved, like it is usually the case in social impact bonds, projects are easy to terminate. And lastly, when infrastructure is involved, cross-sector partnerships take the form of a long-term incomplete contract. And we know that during contract execution, adaptation will be needed and conflictual negotiations might occur. So to conclude, cross-sector partnerships can be seen as an opportunity to face the challenges associated with the support of refugees, as long as implementation difficulties are contained. And this is why the two case studies that will be presented now are interesting from my point of view, because they are, to my knowledge, the two only social outcome-based contracts signed in order to support refugees and to welcome migrants. And we can learn a lot from them as a starting point to improve future cross-sector partnership in this area. That's it for my part.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Stefan. So I'm taking the floor then, I'm Simon Porcher. I'm an associate professor at Sorbonne Business School, and I'm working with Stéphane on various types of public-private contracting or cross-sector partnerships as a whole. So the thanks to the GoLab for organizing it, of course, and for letting me speak about the case that I'm going to present. So I'm going to introduce the Hemisphere Social Impact Fund, which is an original form of cross-sector partnership. If I go back a bit, 6 years ago, with a bit of history, as many European countries, France in 2015 faced a large influx of migrants. And because of the lack of emergency accommodations in France, and because also we have quite a lot of homeless people in France, France had to pay hotel rooms to welcome migrants, which was a very costly solution. So in order to decrease the number of nights spent in hotels, the French government launched in 2017 a call for tender to procure 10,000 units of shelter accommodations and to procure also social support for a period of 10 years to migrants coming on the French territory. Two subsidiaries of a French public development bank called the Caisse des dépôts et consignations, or CDC, I would call it CDC Habitat, jointly responded to the call, creating the Hemisphere Social Impact Fund. So what was different? I guess the first thing was the size of the project. 200 million euros were invested to buy and renovate more than 60 motels and to accommodate and integrate people. To some extent, it's inspired by social impact bonds. So it's not really a social impact bond, but it's inspired in the sense that part of the return on investment is conditioned on the achievement of social outcomes that I will present later on. And also, due to emergency, we could not run a regional pretest, for example, or a regional, evaluation of the process. So we had to automatically cover all the national territory. So there was no pretest, and so that's a real life natural experiment, basically. Next slide, please. So next slide, I'm going to present briefly the stakeholders. So I will start on the right side. On the right side, you have the investors of the project. So you have institutional investors, mostly private firms actually, which invested 100 million euros. And then you have a loan from the Council of Europe Development Bank, a loan of 100 million euros too, which created the Hemisphere Fund. So that's a new vehicle that was created to respond to the call, and that is managed by one subsidiary of CDC Habitat, so the French Public Development Bank. On the left side, you have the operating part of the project with Adoma, another subsidiary of CDC Habitat, but that is specialized actually in dealing with in integrating and accommodating migrants and homeless people. So Adoma operates all the project. They receive a small fee per night and per individual from the French state, and they have to pay then the rents, pay the rent to the Hemisphere Fund, but also pay wages and cover the different center spending. And they are evaluated on a yearly basis by KPMG on the social outcome indicators that I'm going to present on the next slide. So you have 4 different outcomes, so that can trigger the small bonus if the targets are met. Children's school enrollment. So you have an outcome target of 95% in this case. Personalized support, which is just the fact that every migrant has to sign a project to integrate in France in the next years with an outcome target of 90%. Access to social rights, healthcare, particularly with a target of 80%, and service outcomes, which is called also positive exit, the fact that after having been in the refugee center, they can accommodate themselves in a real apartment, for example, or have their own housing, with a target of 70%. So if you look at globally the target right now, in the first year in 2017, that was they were pretty much below those targets, but actually now they are around the targets. But as far as I know, they never had to pay the bonus for meeting the different outcomes so far. But also there was the COVID-19 crisis and so forth. To conclude, last slide, just to thank you, to conclude on the different points. So first, if you look at indicators, so we've been running all these interviews with the managers of the different hotels and centers. And basically the way they perceive indicators as they are social workers, that they do not like to be evaluated on their work for sure. And they do not like also the fact that they have to fulfill indicator on a regular basis. So they say that they feel that indicators are more a burden helping them in their job, and that also collecting users' voice is missing in the indicators. Second point is the global evaluation that is run by KPMG on a yearly basis is more a tick of the box exercise. So they just check the indicators, double check that there's no mistake in the way indicators are fulfilled, but there is no real reflections on how to improve the indicators or how to improve the way we welcome migrants too. And the evaluation is a bit biased because you can have different types of migrants. You can have refugees or just migrants coming from other countries, but who do not hold the status of refugee, and so those guys are most probably going to be sent back to their home country, and so that creates quite a lot of inequalities between centers because they do not have the same type of population. Infrastructure is a huge problem too, because the infrastructure, as Professor Stefan said, is based on brownfield projects. So we just bought motels and renovate them to accommodate people, but those motels have minibar fridges, bulk beds, for example, that are completely inappropriate for families who do not stay one night, but stay several months, even sometimes several years. And so there are quite a huge problem with infrastructure, and a lot of effort should be done on that. And to finish, the big innovation, as Stefan said, is that it's original because we capture private sector money, partly a part of private sector money, to invest in a project that is really at the core of public service to welcome migrants. Thank you. That's all from me.
Great. And I'll sort of discuss the last case study that we had, which is a Quota Social Impact Bond in Finland. So when this project was initially being designed, there were two main challenges that it sort of spoke to. So on the one hand, in 2015, you had asylum applications to Finland, which were 10 times higher than usual. So at the time, this was around 30,000 applications, which is not a very big number when you compare to some of the other countries in the world, as Professor Betts highlighted. But in the context of Finland, in relative terms, this was considered to be quite high. And so there was a lot of political pressure around this particular issue. And then secondly, there were also significant disparities in terms of employment between migrants and native-born peers, and these still exist. So in response, as part of the solution, the Quota Social Impact Bond was launched in 2017. This was a 14.2 million euro social impact bond, which was designed to support employment for 2,500 refugees, so people who had been granted residence permits, as well as immigrants over a period of 3 years. And what it aimed to do was really speed up the employment for these refugees and immigrants and really make that process faster, but also at the same time try and reduce some of the public sector expenditure for the Finnish central government. And so what was different about this project? So I've picked out three sort of main things, and I'll be going into a bit more detail in the rest of my presentation. So firstly, the payment to providers was based on outcomes instead of inputs and activities. So what this meant was they could work in more flexible ways, they could be more innovative as long as they were targeting the pre-agreed outcomes. And so this led to a new way of working. At the same time, they were being tracked over a longer period of time, so they had more incentive to really be invested in the overall long-term success of these individuals rather than just sort of supporting them for 3 months. Secondly, they could then use a place and train model, which was a much more flexible combination of work and training. So they could combine language training with career coaching and work skills, but make sure this was quite customized to the qualifications and preferences of each individual. And then finally, this was also a collaboration between diverse stakeholders, some of whom had never worked together around this particular issue. And it was also able to bring in social investment through the social impact bond model. So I'm going to go into a bit more detail on a couple of these. So firstly, I mentioned that it brought together stakeholders from diverse sectors. So what does that really mean in practice? So firstly, at the heart of the service, of course, you have service providers. So there were multiple service providers involved from both the private sector and the non-profit sector. And of course, it's their ultimate responsibility to be delivering services to refugees and immigrants. In the case of this project, though, they were helped or facilitated through a fund that was created. And this fund was featured investments by a group of investors, a lot of whom were from the private sector. So what they did was they brought forward upfront capital, and they also took the risk for this overall project. And so what this means is that the service providers were transferring their risk onto investors, and at the same time, they did not have to invest any upfront working capital. So once the service was delivered and outcomes were achieved in terms of employment and training, These outcomes are then reported to the outcome pair. In this case, that is the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Employment with the Finnish government, so that's a public sector actor. Once these results are verified, and only at that stage does the government then pay for these outcomes, and it pays into the fund. And so then the investors are repaid their original capital and returns. So this is basically sort of how the project works and how it brings together stakeholders from the public sector, the private sector, and the nonprofit sector, all around sort of shared pre-agreed outcomes, which really help them collaborate and coordinate their various expertise. At the same time, there's also additional support for the project. So the fund is managed by what used to be called FIM, is now called as Bank, and we have Samir, of course, joining us from there as the main sort of lead. And in addition, the results and outcomes are also verified by an independent auditor. The second thing I want to pick on was the outcomes orientation. So as I mentioned, it pays for outcomes rather than inputs or activities. And these are sort of on two different tiers. So on one tier, you have the sort of outcomes which are highlighted in blue. So the increased employment of refugees and immigrants, as well as training of at least 70 days for each individual. So this targets 2,500 individuals each and is validated just through administrative data. And as of October 2020, we had about 1,100 individuals in employment and 1,700 individuals who had been offered at least 70 days of training. But the actual payment for this project is actually at a different sort of level. So the outcomes that you see in green, which is around the increased tax collections and reduced unemployment benefits. So the hypothesis here is that the treatment group in this study, as is being evaluated through a randomized controlled trial, is expected to pay more in taxes, but also to claim less in unemployment benefits, hence generating public sector savings for the government. So on the basis of that RCT, which is still underway, so the results are expected in 2023, that is when the ultimate sort of outcomes will be sort of decided in terms of whether the project was successful. And then the Finnish government will pay 50% of any money saved through the project back into the fund. So just coming to some key learnings from all of this for other social impact bonds, particularly those hoping to support refugees, I've picked out 4 key learnings. So the first one is very much around how an outcomes-based approach can allow additional flexibility and innovation. So the shift from inputs and activities, so previously these service providers would be paid on the number of courses or the hours of training delivered. Now they were being paid for more long-term and sustainable outcomes. So this definitely led to a new way of working. This led to more innovation. So for instance, they could use the place then train model that I mentioned. They could also bring in new coaches who were best suited to the job. So for instance, they could bring in people who had similar linguistic and cultural backgrounds to refugees and who could really, really support them in the best way possible instead of being fixated on particular qualifications or experiences. They could also use much more specific job matching to really match the qualifications and preferences of each individual to jobs. And then finally, they could also be much more flexible. So of course, tweaks were needed along the way. And so these were possible, whether this was around the expansion of the cohort, the change in the training length, or the additional customization. The second learning was around referral mechanisms and contracting and how these must be planned quite early. This was indeed the biggest challenge in the first year. So the referrals were supposed to come through the employment offices, which operate at a municipality level. However, as they had not been very engaged in the development process and had been a bit more distant, the referrals were quite low the first year, and this of course impacted performance initially. So the lesson here is really to involve anyone who's involved in these referral mechanisms really early, to really co-design these, to have really clear buy-in and communication, and to ideally reflect these into formal contracts. The third learning was around user voice and lived experience, how these of course should be at the heart of any project. So it's very easy to say that of course we want to help people into jobs and we want to do this as quickly as possible. But of course, the refugees or immigrants might be at different levels of readiness for work, at different life stages, and might have very different preferences. So some of them might be quite young and might not have any dependents that they need to support, and they might be quite keen to sort of continue language training or be in the classroom and to focus more on their education. However, you might have other refugees or immigrants who are older, who are supporting refugees, who are supporting families or other dependents. And so for them, it would be a priority to go into jobs rather than spend time in the classroom. And others still might be wanting to move on to a different country altogether. So it's really key to understand all of these and understand how to link into engagement, how to link into outcomes, But the good news is that outcomes contracts can allow some of that flex. And then finally, in terms of the evaluation, this should really balance rigor with practical considerations. So as I mentioned, there's a randomized control trial that is being used to evaluate this project. And while that is the gold standard when it comes to evaluation and research, it also brings its own challenges. And in fact, a lot of the stakeholders in the project thought that they were depriving individuals who would then be sorted into the control group of the service due to the RCT. And of course, it is expensive. It takes a long time for the results to come forward. And in that time, it is quite difficult, almost impossible to scale the service, as you would be disrupting the design of the RCT. In addition, it would also be a good idea to perhaps factor in more of the softer qualitative outcomes in the future to really sort of track the progress and well-being of individuals. So just bringing both of those case studies together, so the Hemisphere case study and the Koto case study, we just want to leave you with sort of 3 key takeaways from our side. So firstly, refugees and migrants' needs really should be at the heart of any of these projects. They should really guide the design of outcomes metrics and long-term solutions. When you do have clearly defined and well-communicated outcomes, they can drive collaboration and flexibility in projects, especially where you have an outcomes-based contract. And then finally, core design and buy-in from both strategic as well as operational stakeholders is really crucial for successful implementation in the end. That's everything I'm going to share for now. In terms of outputs, we have initial case studies on the website, but we're also working on a more formal academic paper, so do watch this space. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for this, Tanya, and Stefan and Simon as well. Yeah, so interesting to get an insight into these programs, adopting these outcomes-based approaches in practice to support refugees. And thanks so much for the key learnings and insights at the end. I think that really summarized it quite well. We have a couple minutes for questions. So if anyone does want to raise their hand, please do feel free to raise it now or put a question in the chat. I guess to give everyone a couple minutes, Tanya, I could first come to you. If you could tell us a bit more about the outcomes considered for these projects. So, you know, why certain outcomes were chosen in particular, and if there are any outcomes that could have been incorporated.
Sure, thanks very much, Laura. So I think based on the people that we spoke to, their reflections were that a lot of the outcomes that are at play here were driven by the political urgency at the time, the sort of political climate at the time, but that actually, if they were looking back and if they were to sort of build on the lessons of this impact bond, they would factor in more of the qualitative aspects as well. And they would also factor in more of the outcomes and how they interact with state level or municipality level outcomes. So at the moment, of course, these are only being captured at the sort of federal level or the state level, or the central government level rather. So it would also be good to bring those in, and also to bring in things such as how they impact health, how they impact education, social care, and also larger well-being and quality of life. So those are some of the things that I think people reflected could be brought into the future. But of course, the challenge is that on the one hand, you want to, you know, factor in everything that is valuable and important, and there's so many of those outcomes, but you also want to be quantifiable and measurable. So it's always about striking that balance, I suppose.
Thanks so much for that, Tanya. We've got a question coming up in the chat by Sandra, and I thought maybe Professor Betts might be the best person for this. She asked, can you talk a bit about the role that development financial institutions have played or can play in supporting these cross-sectoral approaches? Professor Betts, feel free, or anyone else can chip in, any other panelists too. Yeah,
there's been a very big and important shift in the role of IFIs, and particularly development banks, in supporting refugees and forced displacement. So most notably, the World Bank has become a much more active participant in this space. And it's unlocked significant amounts of finance. So the bank, for the first time for Jordan in 2016, unlocked significant concessionary finance for a middle-income country, which it wouldn't ordinarily finance, on the grounds of the challenges it faced by hosting a significant refugee population. It subsequently provided significant concessionary finance for Colombia, which currently hosts 1.7 million Venezuelans. And so it's a big source of finance. It's also often open to innovative input. But I think also the development banks are really important as drivers of job creation. So it's also particular arms of those banks. So the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, has been particularly important for sort of thinking about and financing job creation in refugee camps. They they did a significant report in the Kakuma refugee camps in Kenya, where they quantified the value of the economy based on household expenditure and used that to highlight the potential for jobs growth. So I think there's a source of innovative thinking, a source of finance, and a really important contribution to areas like job creation, and also finance for middle-income countries becoming increasingly available.
Thanks so much for that, Professor Betts. We've got loads of questions pouring into the chat now, so it's just always so great to see participants joining in the conversation. We've got a question from Rebecca, which I might come to you, Simon, for this. She said, hi, can you talk a little bit more about the different funding models used? Am I right in that the first project, the payments for outcomes were made to the service providers, but in the second, the payment went to the fund itself?
Well, that might be my mistake, but no. In the first project, the payment for outcomes is done to the investors too. That's why, I mean, they got actually inspired by the traditional social impact bonds, even if it's not really a social impact bond, but they got inspired. I think that they tried basically to surf on the wave of social impact bonds, which were starting getting increasingly popular in the world at the time. But that's exactly the same in the two projects. That so that's not the same exactly way to fund to pay the different investors, but outcomes actually, I mean, the first project, you know, the payment and outcomes is done to the investors and not to the service provider. The service provider just receive a small allowance from the French state, actually.
Perfect. Thanks so much for clarifying that, Simon. We've also got a question coming in from Krisha. I guess we could open this to Stefan, Simon, and Tanya. Are there any specific learnings on how evaluations need to be done differently in these contexts? How can one think about attribution or challenges related to data collection? If any of you feel free to chip in on that.
Very easy questions. I don't know if I want to step in. No, obviously this is very difficult to know how you should evaluate the performances through complex RCT evaluation, or just looking at how the performance are evolving through time. It depends of how easy it is to find some counterfactuals and some groups that you can compare with your own project, basically, I believe. But I'm not sure.
I think, I mean, maybe I could just add, I think one of the things I find really exciting about this work is that you are doing RCTs and intervention-based studies. And obviously in an ideal world, that's one of the best ways to get robust evidence on whether particular interventions work and under what conditions. I think, though, the sector as a whole, at least the humanitarian field in which this sits, has tended to favor retrospective evaluations, and they have massive limitations because often there's implementation of projects in the absence of baseline data, then evaluation is done post hoc at the end, and so the evidence base across the sector is weak. And so everything I've heard, I think, is a really massive contribution on the methodology. The only caveat to that is sometimes RCT-based methods have ethical challenges in particularly vulnerable refugee populations. And so a lot of thought needs to go into inclusion and exclusion of opportunities. The control group, if they're disadvantaged by not having access to a particular treatment, or the treatment group isn't in a position to provide informed consent, that introduces challenges. And so sometimes there can be ethical justification for using more classic post hoc survey methods to evaluate impact.
Thanks so much for that, Professor Betts. I also thought we could bring in Dr. Mara Eroldi. So she's academic director at the Go Lab. I thought you might have some comments on this as well in terms of evaluations.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. It's a very good question, Krisha. And in part, I echo what Alexandra was just saying about the ethical concern of randomized control trial in this setting. And often when in outcome contracts, a randomized control trial has been used to trigger payment, has been in a context of rationing of services. So the number of people to whom we can offer a service is quite small compared to the population in need. And so there is a sense that allocating people to a service randomly is a fair way to allocate, and it also lends itself to do an evaluation. In the case in Finland, clearly this was not the case, because there were people who might have benefited from this service, and so this is the ethical consideration. So I think it is considered like the obvious tool to create attribution and to generate learning, but the ethical considerations are big. If the need is massive, actually the ethical consideration push you towards a random allocation, so it's a win-win. But you need to tread it very carefully. And we've seen a number of evaluation where a difference in difference method has been used. So there is not really a random allocation, but there are other like statistically valid methods to come up with a control group that is good enough for the purpose of the payment. But it's a very good question, Krisha.
Thanks so much for that, Mara. Amazing. Well, it's great as always to see conversations flowing in the chat. So I know that we have a really exciting panel discussion coming up. So without further ado, I'm going to pass on to my colleague, Andreea and Anastasiu. Thank you so much, panelists, so far for speaking, and everyone for joining in. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Laura, and good afternoon from Oxford, everyone. Huge thanks to Professor Betts, Professor Saucier, Simon, and Tanya for the excellent presentation. So in the first part of the discussion, Professor Betts painted a really daunting picture of the challenges we face. And Professor Betts, I would love to come to you later on in the discussion, perhaps to share some of the encouraging action that you're seeing as well. But we've seen we're facing huge challenges. Clearly, action is required on multiple levels by multiple stakeholders. And our researchers at the Go Lab and the Sorbonne Business School have presented two really interesting examples. But of course, those are not the only outcomes-based approaches in this space seeking to support refugees. And Stefan, sorry to disagree with you, there are actually other impact bonds or outcomes-oriented partnerships in this space. So it's my great pleasure to introduce three additional speakers to our discussion. They each come from very different contexts, with very different ranges of experience, I suppose, but all three of them have a really rich set of expertise and knowledge around supporting refugees. So with that, Beatrice, Joanna, and Samir, it's my great pleasure to welcome you into the discussion. So Beatrice is joining us from COIS. She's joining, I think, from Belgium today, but she'll be bringing in the perspective of someone who's worked extensively in low and middle income country context. And then we have Joanna joining from the UK. She's the head of refugee integration in the UK's Home Office. And then we have Samir, who will be sharing more practical insights from his work on the Koto Sea. Before we jump into the discussion, and really great to see all the questions in the chat, Beatrice, Joanna, and then Samir, could I ask each one of you to briefly introduce yourselves and just tell us a few words perhaps about your work in relation to outcomes-based approaches that are supporting refugees. So over to you first, Beatrice.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you for this introduction and having me. So yes, I work at COIS. We are an impact finance and innovative finance advisory firm headquartered in Brussels and Mumbai. We were created 7 years ago, and our first project was actually a small social impact bond in Brussels for the integration of first-time youth migrants into employment. And that led to several, quite a bit of work actually in social and development impact bonds, for which we're quite well known, mainly around employment and some around refugee employment. Recently, the refugee impact bond, which I had the honor of taking across the finishing line.
Great, thanks so much, Beatrice. Joanna, could we come to you next?
Hi, everybody. Nice to meet you all. I'm Joanna Penrose-Buckley, as Andrea said, from the Home Office, UK government. So I'm in the process with the team that I lead of mobilising a series of social impact bonds. They were actually really interestingly based on two of the examples that I presented earlier. So we drew inspiration both from Hemisphere and from the example in Finland. So it's good to be on a panel with you to sort of say that, like, I had several calls with the Finnish government at the time, asking for their ideas and presenting what we were planning to do and saying, like, do you think this is going to work? Which was super useful to be able to get that experience. So I'll just briefly say what the fund is, because that will help you to understand sort of the purpose of being here. But essentially, we brought 3 different government departments together in a partnership. We won a policy innovation funding competition, which is how we were able to get some ring fence funding to set it up. And then we had a second investor come from a different government department to top up our fund. And the purpose of the fund is to support refugee integration, particularly focusing on helping people into housing and employment. And it's not just employment, it's also self-employment, so it's also for entrepreneurs. And that's just mobilising at the moment in the UK.
Super, thanks for that, Joanna. It's a pleasure to have you on the panel. And Samir, could we go to you next?
Hello, my name is Samir Omar, and thanks for the invitation for this panel discussion. I work at S Bank as the head of intervention program management. That's kind of a long title, but that means that I run 2 social impact funds, and they're both focusing on employment. The first one is, of course, Kotosip, Immigrant Employment Fund, which was at the time of inception one of the biggest, if not the biggest, social impact fund in Europe. And the other fund focuses on employment of long-term unemployed, and that is kind of like the continuation for Kotosip, because in Kotosip the intervention period is over, and the work continues with the other fund. Its target group includes mostly native Finns, but as well as immigrants and refugees. And I have been involved from the start to finish of this project, including the planning, financial modeling, tendering process, fund setup, fundraising, and managing the intervention programs. For these 2 funds, I run the fund management and the intervention program management. And my day-to-day work is coordinating between the different stakeholders, like the commissioner, employment offices, service providers, and investors, and of course the end customers, the immigrants and the refugees. And the high number of stakeholders actually means that these kind of projects are very complicated. So this means that we had to pivot many times in order to have a smooth program. For example, in Kotosip, the target group was originally refugees, but was later expanded to include all immigrants who didn't have a Finnish citizenship. And I've been doing this work for the last 5 years. It's been very satisfying, a lot of learning by doing, and it's you know, kind of opening the way for similar future projects. And I think I've made all the mistakes, so maybe the people who run future projects don't have to do the same mistakes as well.
Thank you so much, Samir. Great to have you on the session. I see some new comments and questions in the chat as well. And I should have mentioned earlier, just to make sure we give some structure to the discussion, we wanted to organize the last half an hour so that we have together around 2 core questions. So one is around exploring in more detail the role that outcomes-focused partnerships can play in providing more holistic and better support for refugees. And then linked to that, you know, we've got some great practitioners here. We want to hear from them some of their lessons learned, advice, practical implications, practical considerations that policymakers and others interested in designing outcomes-based approaches themselves should keep in mind. So with that, Samir, perhaps I can come to you first. So you've mentioned some of the mistakes perhaps that you've made along the way. It would be great to hear from your perspective, just being at the heart of the Kotosip, what have been some of the key learnings, and perhaps if you take us back to the start first, what were the initial assumptions and rationales around developing the project? What have you learned over the past 4 years or so?
Thank you. So like Tanya already mentioned, the commissioner, the Ministry of Employment, wanted to respond to 2015 refugee crisis. And the sad fact is that it takes an average of 6 to 7 years for the first employment of refugees. Of course, that is an average, and it includes those who never get employed. But the commissioners and our idea was that 6 to 7 years is 5 to 6 years too long. And the traditional way of integration training in Finland is so that you have a 12-month integration training. And then usually most of the participants continue to preparatory vocational training, which is another word for more language training. And that lasts for 6 to 12 months. And then they usually go to vocational training. And the reason why they go to vocational training is that if you complete your vocational training, you don't have to do your language test when you apply for citizenship. And after the vocational training, they continue through work practices and other services provided by the employment offices. And that first employment comes on average after 6 to 7 years. So the commissioner wanted something faster. So we developed a fast track model, which consists of 3 to 6 months of intensive work skill and language training. And then as soon as possible, we try to provide the employment. And then we continue the training and support along the way. So basically, like what it was mentioned before, there were around 30,000 asylum seekers, and the government felt that it's going to take a toll on the budget, housing, training, and so forth. So they wanted to try something new. So they set up a trial and see how this new innovative funding and operational model could impact the employment of refugees. And if successful, these models could be used as a blueprint for services bought by the employment offices. So the outcomes was actually signed by the commissioners, and being the first of its kind, the commissioner opted for a traditional tendering process. This meant that the outcomes, the trial setup, and the measurement, impact measurement were designed by them in advance. And I really think that this is not the optimal way to plan this kind of project, but nevertheless, the results, the end results were pretty good.
Great, thanks for that, Samir. And Tanya mentioned in her presentation that the project is due to conclude in 2023. What's next? What's the learning that we're taking away from this project and applying, I guess, more widely in the way refugees are supported in Finland or beyond? Do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, actually, already maybe a couple of years after the start of Kotoship, the Helsinki region or the region around Helsinki tendered the integration training, and we saw from those documents that they were taking the same kind of ideas we used already at that point. So they had a fast track employment training, and then they had another track for people with academic background. That was also something we kind of launched. And also there were some small, but it was a good first step, small bonuses tied to the outcomes.
Great, thanks for that, Samir. Beatrice, can I turn to you now? Because Professor Betts mentioned in his introduction how high-income countries face completely different contexts to the challenges that low and middle-income countries face. And I know you've worked extensively, and COIS itself as an organization has lots of experience working both in high-income countries and low and middle-income countries. So I'd really like to come to you for some reflections around the specific challenges in low and middle-income countries. And then if you can give me more information on how you've navigated those for the refugee tips that you've developed in Jordan.
Okay, that's a tough question. So first of all, I'll just say a quick word on the refugee impact bond. As you mentioned, it's for Jordan. Investors have funded or committed $10 million of funding over 4 years for an entrepreneurship program, mainly for women and youth, vulnerable local populations and refugees, with the expectation of being reimbursed at the end of the 4 years by 2 European private foundations, Novo Nordisk Foundation, IKEA Foundation, and NORAD, the Norwegian aid agency. Investors being a DFI, the DFC, and FIRD. It's a project in terms of, first of all, what you're addressing, I guess, is different in low and middle income countries than in high income countries. Mainly, I mean, the reason why we embarked on this project is the realization that there is much too little programs and funding towards livelihood programs in humanitarian context. That was a realization we made in 2016, and obviously we weren't alone, and it's still very much the case. It remains, livelihoods remains one of the most, if not the most, underfunded pillars of humanitarian aid agencies. So that's the gap you're filling. Which you know, it means that when you're developing your impact bond and designing the metrics, deciding on which metrics to use and what value or price to put on those metrics is potentially a little bit trickier than in high income countries, where you know the cost or the opportunity cost of the job not, you know, the person not being employed. You know the additional tax revenues, as was mentioned. You know the unemployment benefits that you're saving when people are in a job. Whereas in an environment where this, you know, the fiscal system and this social support is different or inexistent, you're basically, you know, trying you know, first of all, deciding on the metric, as I said, putting this price, you will be putting it in relation, maybe, for example, to other projects, other development livelihoods programs, their cost per user, aspects like that. Or you might be trying to estimate the long-term economic value that you are creating with each individual that is receiving these trainings. But that's an economic value that is being provided to the person, to the system, to the country in which it is he or she is residing now, and a value that person will be bringing with her or him back to their home country if they are, or a resettlement country if that happens. I guess the other you know, challenge or different is linked, you know, with an impact bond is linked to the instrument itself. Here, you know, in the Koto or other projects, usually in social impact bonds, the host country would be interested in these outcomes being realized, knows the price, and commissions the project. When you're working in a low middle income country context, usually the host country is already, you know, dependent on foreign aid to be able to support the refugees and the impact on its economy. So you are basically having to, you know, fundraising is a challenge. Convincing donors, whether private or public, to contribute in this way to solving a challenge, and why it is worth doing it through this lengthy and thus costly process, why it brings additional benefits rather than doing it through a traditional grants. That's definitely a challenge that you would have in lower middle income settings versus high income. And I'll probably stop there, and then we might have additional questions.
Thank you so much, Beatrice, for such an insightful answer. So actually, can I stay with you? I've noticed a question in the chat a bit earlier from Kun Peng. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, because you've touched on metrics and payments and so on. So I just wondered if you could share a bit more about the process of defining and agreeing metrics for the refugee deep, and just more generally, Kun was asking two questions. So how do we think such programs could be structured around migrant workers wanting to establish their own businesses, so that feels relevant to your project? And then secondly, how do we or should we incorporate metrics that are focused on legal protection, integration, as opposed to just employment metrics? And perhaps on this second question, Professor Betts, perhaps I can bring you in as well. But over to you, Beatrice, first.
Thank you. So in terms of the process, obviously, first of all, the idea is, of course, to be able to measure as much as possible, and as much as possible tie payments to the deep outcome goals of the program you are funding. In the case of the refugee impact bond, the deep outcome or impact goals is resilience building through increased agency and through economic inclusion of vulnerable groups. Now, immaterial outcomes such as women's agency, bargaining power, etc., are notoriously difficult to tie payments to, just because it's a different mindset, a different system. So what we found as metrics, and what we decided on the metrics we decided on here, were twofold, and you make that decision based on what is quantifiable on the one hand, and on the other hand, what do you have data on? What do you have either comparable data from similar programs in other contexts? If you don't have data from that specific context, and do you actually, if it's not a pilot program, do you already have program track record data for the one you are funding and trying to scale up? So in this case, we had data from previous iterations from the program, but it was implemented so that the NGO we are funding is Near East Foundation. They had good quality data, but not super good, if we may say. We had robust enough data on the survival of the businesses that were created in previous iterations 4 to 6 months after the grants they received to set up the businesses. So what we decided to do, the data was robust enough, but impact bonds have to be also an element of risk and pushing the implementer to improve its performance on past iterations. Otherwise, there's no point in rewarding the investors, right? For a risk, there has to be a real risk taken by investors for these to be worth the point. So we set the target they had, the maximum target they had to reach it 4 or 6 months after on previous iterations. We pushed it to, we set the same target to 10 months after each training, after each cohort training. Now, the way we will evaluate that is not through any sophisticated experimental method. It would really basically be assessing whether the business exists and counting those businesses and comparing them to the targets that were set. Now, as I mentioned, the outcome target of this project is the improvement in household well-being. It's household resilience. It's the ability to withstand future shocks that they will encounter. The best way to measure that is through the measurement of household consumption, because household consumption will by definition be on basic needs when you're talking about this group in this setting. So ideally, we would have measured, all the payments would have been based on this metric. But as I mentioned, the data we had were of not good enough quality. which is why we decided that only 1/3 of the potential investor profits or interest would derive from this metric. And it will be measured through a quasi-experimental method. One of the reasons is clearly ethical. We couldn't go through an RCT, and there were other complexities linked. And we will work with statistical matching. Basically, this outcome will be measured 2 years after the first cohort of the program. So we are trying to measure as long as possible after implementation. So this one will be measured 2 years after, and what we will be doing is comparing the consumption level of the beneficiaries of the first cohort, so the treated group, with the level of participants entering the third cohort.
Thanks for that very detailed answer, Beatrice. Professor Betts, could I come to you for any reflections on the types of outcomes we might or should be using for these cross-sector partnerships?
Yeah, I mean, I find the refugee impact bond very exciting, and it's in a context in which I've done a bit of work. I think Beatrice is absolutely right that there's a massive funding gap around livelihoods programs for refugees and displaced people. It's one of the most important areas in terms of its impact on well-being, but also on surrounding host communities. But it's also an area where the kind of language that's used by international humanitarian organizations around things like refugee self-reliance is often difficult to measure, quite vague, and where we don't have adequate measurement or even metrics within the sector. So I think the kind of innovation that's being described, not just in the financing mechanism and the incentives it creates, but also in the measurement and methodologies around measurement that underlie it, is really exciting. I mean, one of the sort of multi-stakeholder initiatives that I worked on, particularly in Jordan, which I suppose is a precursor to some of this thinking, was the so-called Jordan Compact in 2016, which was led by the UK government, but working with the World Bank, the European Union, and trying to involve private sector investment. And it worked based on the logic of trying to create the right to work for Syrian refugees in a country where up to that point, Syrian refugees had no legal right to work. And the logic was that it started with Jordan's existing development strategy to make the leap to manufacturing, to try to get investment in manufacturing industry. It observed that Jordan had special economic zones, but while the government had invested significantly in them, they lacked labor, and yet there were literally hundreds of thousands of refugees locked out of the labor market. And so what happened was the EU committed to provide trade concessions for products produced in the economic zones involving refugee workers. The World Bank committed to provide concessionary finance, and business was engaged to try to get commitments. And IKEA was one of those investing businesses, and has obviously learned from that. And the foundation has been one of the partners in the Impact Investment Bond. The outcomes are mixed. It created 200,000 work permits for Syrian refugees, the right to work for refugees in a country where it didn't exist. But I wonder, sort of reflecting on it, whether had we had social impact bonds present in that multi-stakeholder collaboration, whether the outcomes could have improved. Partly the lack of clarity over the intended outcomes, the lack of measurability, the lack of evidence generation in the process was one of the reasons why aspects of it didn't work. There was a lack of co-design as well, which we've heard earlier from what Tanya said, with refugees, with key stakeholders in the process. So I think when I think about some of the past examples of public-private partnership, multi-stakeholder collaboration, it sort of highlights to me that social impact bonds, had they been present in that, could have improved the outcomes, could have improved the measurement of those outcomes, and that there's a whole series of areas in which the metrics across the sector are poor, and where everything that Beatrice described can be extremely helpful.
That's really interesting, Professor Betts. Thought worth exploring about, what if SIBs had been used, how things might have looked differently. Joanna, I'd like to come to you in a second, because I think someone in the chat asked earlier, how might we attract more private financing and private investors into tackling this hugely complex and important issue? And I think, Stefan, you've mentioned scale. So I think on the point of scale, the use of outcome funds is something that keeps coming up in relation to outcomes-based approaches. Before we come to you, Joanna, just for more information on the Refugee Transition Outcome Fund, I would just like to pause for a second just to check if anyone among our participants has any questions. Do raise your hand if you want to ask anything, or maybe share your own experience on working to support refugees. Okay, I can't see any hands up for now, so I think, Joanna, will come to you.
Thanks, Andrea. Yeah, I think the question about scale is really interesting, because I think it was Stefan or possibly Simon that said that actually when we were looking in the UK context, there wasn't actually a massive evidence base to support what we were trying to do. That's why we looked so heavily, particularly at what had been done in Finland. We also did extensive research, like multi-country research, to see actually what is there that shows us where are the best outcomes for refugees being achieved for self-sufficiency. And we drew very heavily on one of Professor Betts's colleagues, Carlos Vargas Silva, who's done some very interesting work in the UK on that. His work shows that it takes 25 years for a refugee to equalise with the outcomes of a native-born British person in terms of employment. And at 25 years, that's hours of work is equalised but not pay. So that's really a generation. So that's like a huge challenge to try and address. But in terms of scale, so we had all this research that we showed that showed that actually there's a huge amount that can be done here. Outcomes can definitely be improved. But when you don't have a great deal of evidence around the particular initiative you're going for, it's quite difficult to attract investment into that. So for us, we're starting with a £14 million fund. We've got social investors who are investing into that in a similar way, I think, to what Hemisphere did, that basically the social investors provide the capital up front, which allows the service providers to implement and do the work. So they're not implementing at risk, but the investors have put their capital at risk. And if they don't achieve the outcomes, then obviously they don't get paid. In addition, I think the question of scale that for us was quite complex is how do you negotiate a rate card when you haven't done it before? Because Beatrice, I thought your point was interesting that governments know. And when you said that, I was thinking, I think that depends a little bit on how evident the policy area you're trying to do a SIB in is. For us, we do have other, in the UK, other SIBs that have worked on employment or housing. So there were on a kind of mix and match basis, we were able to look at what rate cards looking at either housing or employment had paid, but none of those were refugee specific. So those vulnerable populations that had benefited from the other SIBs faced different challenges to refugees. And broadly speaking, I would say that particularly the challenges of being new to the country and not necessarily speaking English present additional barriers to entry to the labour market versus the other populations we were looking at. So there was quite a lot of going backwards and forwards to say this is how much we will pay. And on the rate card, we've got a central government rate card that's not adapted locally. So it's one rate card for the whole fund across the whole country. And as the policymaker, you're thinking, okay, if we get this wrong, we could either create perverse incentives that we actually don't get the thing we were looking for, or that everybody chooses to only deliver the easiest to deliver services, which is again what we're interested in. So yeah, it was an interesting question, but I think we've had a huge amount of learning. And actually, Samir, as you were saying, it'd be really interesting to connect with you to hear more about what you've learned, because I think seeing people who've gone further down the journey and getting them to look back at what we're doing now and kind of feed in is really useful to us.
What would some of those key learnings be, Joanna? Just really quickly, I'm sure there are loads, but anything in particular that you want to highlight?
Yeah, I think maybe one of the points in the chat was around entrepreneurship and self-employment. So what value do you put on that versus someone being employed? Because, for instance, as government, we're not only looking at kind of savings to the public purse in terms of reduced benefits dependency. For some people, new refugees in the UK, actually social integration will be a massively positive outcome for them. So even if they run a small business a few hours a week, but that begins to help them to learn more English and become more integrated in their community, economically it may not be like particularly impactful, but at a personal level it could be really impactful. And also the more that you get integrated, even if it's a slow integration over time, it actually puts you in a better place if you do want to work more, scale your business up in the future. So sometimes you have to think over the long term, not just over like a 5-year time horizon. So for entrepreneurship, in the end, we ended up putting on our rate card the same amount that we're going to pay for employment. We felt that that was fair, and we did quite a lot of testing. We'd done some previous grant funded work, and we tested with the organisations that we had funded whether they thought that would work. So that was the approach we took. But other learnings, I think, is just the need. So we've tried to really learn from other social impact bonds in the UK, talking to them, talking to other commissioners and testing our approach. So very much like kind of working with others and testing as we go. And when we have a hypothesis of how we think something will work, we want to check that with others to make sure they think it sounds reasonable, because it's the first time that we've done it. So not we as UK government, but we as the department I work for. So.
That's great. Thanks for that, Joanna. So we've got lots of questions, but unfortunately we're almost at time. And we assume that a lot of the participants are here because they're perhaps themselves considering how in their work they might use or take an outcome-focused approach to develop programs that support refugees. So before we say goodbye, I would like to invite each of our incredible panelists to share one practical tip, advice, or one reflection that you want our participants to take away from this session. And I'll go to each one of you in the order that I have on my screen. So Samir, I'll come to you first, and Joanna, Professor Betts, Beatrice, then Stefan, Simone, and Tanya. So over to you first, Samir. Just a very quick 1-minute takeaway.
Yeah, I will be very quick, but I have a couple of key learnings. First of all, plan together with the commissioner, and convince them that they should be this should be tendered by a negotiation process, not by traditional process. And we need to forget the old mentality that there's a buyer and seller, and they are sitting on the other side of the table. We are in this together. So if one party wins, then everybody wins. Another issue which we talked about a little bit, RCTs. They are, from academic point of view, they are the best way to set up a trial. But once you manage the program like this, it's going to be a problem. So for Kotosip, it meant that a lot less people started the program, around 30 to 40% less than without it. And also, of course, individuals. It's a personal tragedy. Many people didn't have the chance to join the program, or actually similar programs also in the future, because otherwise they will distort the impact measurement. So really be careful if you are planning on RCT. It has its problems, and you just end up creating more problems than you actually solve. And the last point is that make sure that every stakeholder is committed. And in Kotosip, there was a mistake that the employment offices were not committed in the beginning. So we had real problems the first year and a half, that we didn't have enough immigrants in the program. So these are the key takeaways. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Amir. Joanna, what's your key takeaway?
Yes, just really quick. For any potential commissioners listening, this can sound hugely complicated, and you can kind of think, oh, I don't know if I can do it. It's not rocket science. It takes time to learn. Like, you do definitely need to speak to other commissioners and stuff, but I think it's worth the leap. And as Samir said, I think the benefit of the adaptive management approach, that actually that you can adapt things as you go, so that if the initial approach isn't working, you can actually change it mid-flight, is, from a value for money point of view, as a commissioner, brilliant. But it's also really good for the service providers on the ground, because they're not stuck delivering the thing they said they were going to deliver. They're allowed to sort of like flex that and make it work in a way that really works for their end beneficiaries. So I think that's key learning.
That's brilliant. Very practical, very applied, Joanna. Thanks for that. Professor Betts?
I want to come back to Tanya's 3 takeaways, where she mentioned co-design and also involving the people most affected, refugees themselves. If you're going to decide which outcomes to prioritize and how to measure them, you need people with real expertise. And in this case, the people with probably the greatest expertise are people with lived experience of displacement. So I think finding ways to meaningfully include participation and even the leadership of refugees and forcibly displaced people in the design of social impact bonds, and particularly the setting of outcomes and ways of measuring them, would be a very important part of moving this forwards.
Thanks for that. Involving the intended beneficiaries in this project is a message that comes out of most of the sessions there with you. So thanks for reinforcing that point. Beatrice and Professor Saucier.
Yes, actually, I was going to say the same. To start with the needs of the beneficiaries, but the needs of the context. And if you keep that at the heart of the solution you find, the structure you design, and it will not only, it would actually facilitate, and it will keep you going however the challenge is, because you will basically be doing the right thing. And this sounds absolutely silly, and this is not how I wanted to say it, but if you start with the needs of users, make sure that there's actually additionality and a need for the instrument, the SIB or DIB, which might not be necessary because they are complicated. If you are convinced about that and you structure it in the way we've all been describing it, then you will be successful, you will succeed. And be transparent, share the learnings, and we have been so here, but there is sometimes a worry in the sector that we are not, and I'm saying us intermediaries and others, transparent enough about the challenges involved, also about the results after implementation, when it has started, about intermediaries' results and the final results that you can inform the field.
Thanks, Beatrice. I think that was slightly more than one key takeaway, but they're all brilliant. So thank you for that. So finally, on to our incredible researchers, so Professor Saucier and Simone and Tanya.
Stefan, Andrea. Okay, just two remarks to conclude. So first, the scale issue. I believe that many of you just stress the fact that we need more money and we need more investment to be prepared to welcome refugees and to take care of them. And I think that there is a private appetite to invest in such projects, and maybe there is a private appetite as soon as the project is just scale up, maybe through PPP, through public-private partnerships, where private companies are financing infrastructure as well as providing the services, like in the Hemisphere case. So this is my first point. My second remark is metrics. We focus a lot on metrics and the way to measure performances. I will not come back on what have been said, because I really agree that all those metrics should be simple, observable, verifiable, and there is an issue of co-design and so on. But at the same time, I would like to stress that maybe as soon as you get some metrics and you are conditioning the payment to the performances, you are transferring the risk to the service providers and to the funders. And maybe you should not transfer too much, especially if you are considering public-private partnerships, because you've got some infrastructures at stake, and private companies would not agree to take too much risk in such projects. That's my two final remark.
Thanks for that. Thank you. Thanks, Stefan. Simon?
Yes, thanks for giving me the floor. So I would say three things. First, Samir said plan. I would say listen to the field, listen to the social workers, let them share their experience, let them share their good practices with the investors or even between them, because I mean, we do not listen that much to those guys who are upfront. Start with the needs also, as Beatrice said, adapt to the situation. In the case of Hemisphere, that means improved infrastructure. Clearly, the infrastructure was ill-designed for welcoming refugees. And then to end up, I mean, it's close to what Stefan just said, but governments should motivate private partners to engage in current challenges, because I mean, they have so much money, basically, if you take it globally, that I believe that they have some preconception maybe of this business, but they might engage in it and participate in funding this kind of public services.
Okay, thanks for that. And over to Tanya to close this session.
Thanks very much. The disadvantage of going last is that everything's been already said, but just to echo what others already said, I think there's clear value in bringing different expertise together, whether that's refugees themselves, service providers, different sectors, to really like building on that expertise, bringing everyone together and doing that around shared outcomes. And then, as Beatrice said, really being open to learning and evaluation. So as we're doing here, really sharing the successes, sharing the failures, being open to data sharing, and therefore ensuring that we can move forward together collectively and really sort of try and build on what we've done and try and support refugees better. Thanks very much.
It's brilliant. Huge thanks to all our panelists and to everyone who's joined us this afternoon. I really apologize for running slightly over time, but it's been such an incredible discussion. I've certainly learned an awful lot, and I hope everyone in the audience has too. And with that, huge thanks everyone, and goodbye, and hope to see you all in January for our next session. Bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye.